while losing it on another. With so much warfare, who had time for art, architecture, or theater? The Middle Ages began with the fall of Rome and continued until the Renaissance or cultural rebirth in 1400, approximately a 1,000-year stretch. For centuries, scholars called the entire period the Dark Ages, meaning the light of knowledge that was the hallmark of classical Greek and Roman culture had been doused. But as 19th-century researchers learned more and more about the second half of the Middle Ages, they realized that it wasn't as dark as they'd once thought. The 12th century, for example, had a kind of mini-Renaissance, an appetizer for what was to come in the 15th century. So scholars scaled back the Dark Ages by about 400 years, dubbing the brighter part the Middle Ages, while stigmatizing the earlier era, AD 500. A.D.1000, as the Dark Ages. Today, scholars recognize that the scaled-down version of the Dark Ages has some bright spots, too. So they call the entire 1,000-year era the Middle Ages or the medieval period, while quietly acknowledging that the first part is dimmer than the second. Bottom line, it was harder to get an education, see a play, or get your teeth fixed in the 8th century than it was in the 13th. In this chapter, I shed some light on the entire era, from manuscripts to tapestries and Gothic architecture, sculpture, and painting. Irish Light, illuminated manuscripts. The knowledge accumulated over 1,300 years in Greece, Alexander's Hellenistic Empire, and Rome didn't suddenly disappear with Rome's demise. It went into hiding in monasteries scattered across Europe. The light of learning burned brightest in the hushed and secluded monasteries of Ireland. St. Patrick converted the Irish to Christianity in the first half of the 5th century AD, just a couple decades before the fall of Rome. Because Ireland had never been absorbed into the Roman Empire, it remained almost completely independent of Roman traditions, including Roman religious and art traditions. The Irish Celts developed their own breed of Christianity and their own style of religious art. The popes didn't have much say in Ireland until the 12th century when England conquered it and imposed both English and papal law on Irish kings and bishops. After Ireland's conversion, the Irish didn't build lots of churches as other Christian countries did. They erected lots of monasteries instead, which evolved into great centers of learning. In monastery workshops called scriptoria, Irish monks copied all the manuscripts they could lay their hands on, including Latin versions of the Bible, writings of the Church Fathers, and classical texts. Between about 600 and 900, the monks distributed these books throughout Europe as part of their mission to Christianize the world. This network of monks spread knowledge around like a traveling university, founding branch schools in Britain, France, Switzerland, Germany, Austria, Italy, and even Iceland. In the following sections, we examine early Irish and Hiberno-Saxon illuminated manuscripts. Browsing the Book of Kells, Lindisfarne Gospels, and other manuscripts. The Irish monks developed a unique style of manuscript illumination, freely borrowing elements from their pagan past, like entwined animals and knotted lace patterns. The new style that they developed is called Hiberno-Saxon. The Romans called the Irish Hiberni. That Saxon part of the term refers to the English contributions to the new style. These contributions were made after the Irish established monasteries in England and began rubbing creative elbows with local populations. The greatest example of the mixed Irish and English style is the Lindisfarne Gospels. Notice how the detailed interlacing is similar to the Book of Kells, a purely Irish illuminated manuscript. The greatest two illuminated manuscripts that are strictly Irish in style are the Book of Doe and the Book of Kells. The Book of Kells was probably created between 803 and 805, primarily in an Irish monastery on the tiny island of Iona off the coast of Scotland. Vikings attacked the island first in 795, then in 802, and again in 805. The surviving monks fled, taking the unfinished Book of Kells with them to the town of Kells, 39 miles outside of Dublin. The image of the Lindisfarne Gospels in the color section and the Book of Kells image referred to in the appendix show the opening page of the Gospel of Matthew. The large stylized initials, XPI, are the first three letters of Christ's name in Greek, chi, rho, and iota. This trinity of letters was often used in the Middle Ages as a monogram to represent Christ. The rest of the text is in Latin. The three stylized letters on the Book of Kells page partially frame large decorative wheels, which in turn frame smaller wheels that circumscribe even smaller wheels. The whole design has the feel of a system of intermeshing gears made out of pinwheels. The curved and angular shapes meld to form a perfect visual harmony. The overall impression is both wild and controlled. As you lose yourself in the interwoven patterns of the design maze, figures jump out at you. The head of a man grows out of the curling stem of the letter P, three golden-winged angels peer at you from the left edge of the X, and a pair of cats crouch on the bottom right scroll of the same initial, eyeing two mice who heretically nibble a communion host. Two big mice ride the cats' backs, teasing them. The pre-Christian Celts believed in the interconnectedness of all things. They illustrated their belief by interweaving images of plants, animals, and spirits into complex lacy patterns on their jewelry, weapons, and monuments. After they became Christians, they didn't renounce their earlier beliefs. Instead, they merged them with Christian doctrine. In the Book of Kells, they symbolically harness their old belief system to the opening initials of Christ's name. In this way, they show that the old ways have been absorbed by the Christian God, not nullified by him. Book curses. Before copyright laws, monks used book curses to protect books, not from potential plagiarists but from book bandits. The gold used in illuminations and the rarity of books made them a great temptation to thieves. The scribe usually wrote his curse in the colophon. Here's a typical medieval book curse. This book belongs to the Abbey of St. Mary Indiana Arnstein, which, if anyone should take away, may he die surely by being cooked in a pan, have the falling sickness and fevers draw near him, may he be hung up and twisted around. Amen. Drolleries and the fun style. In the 12th and 13th centuries, the first European universities emerged in Bologna and Padua, in Italy, in Paris and Montpellier, in France, in Oxford and Cambridge, in England, in Salamanca, Spain, and in Lisbon, Portugal. Students needed books, and monasteries couldn't meet the demand. So bookmakers called stationers sprang up in university towns. To satisfy an increasingly secular market, stationers produced new types of books. Herbals, books about plants and their medicinal uses. Bestiaries, collections of fables, stories in which animals act like people. Books of hours, devotional books for everyday people. Books of secrets, volumes of love potions, remedies, and even spells to prevent people from talking behind your back. With a widening public, books had to entertain, too. In about 1240, a new, fun style emerged in Paris and soon spread across France and England. It featured whimsical, hybrid creations called drolleries or grotesqueries, a nun with the body of a platypus, a mole-headed priest, a pigeon-footed knight with insect wings and a serpent's tail. These grotesqueries sometimes peek over the borders of the page to eavesdrop on your reading. Creative book illuminators also braided flowers and foliage with the writhing tails of dragons and serpents or the tendril-like necks of exotic birds. Drolleries were the rage for about 250 years. Charlemagne, king of his own Renaissance. On Christmas Day in the year 800, the Roman Empire made a comeback, or so people thought. Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne Holy Roman Emperor before cheering crowds, shouting Emperor and Augustus. Between 768 and 800, Charlemagne had conquered almost all of Western and Central Europe. It seemed he'd resurrected the Roman Empire. Charlemagne wasn't content just resurrecting the political and geographical side of the Western Empire, he wanted to launch a classical culture rebirth, too. The rebirth he fostered is called the Carolingian Renaissance. It was another mini-Renaissance before the big one in the 15th century. Charlemagne encouraged monasteries and churches to operate schools, copy manuscripts, and develop a universal calligraphic script. To that end, he invited scholars from Ireland, England, Spain, Italy, and Gaul to his capital in Aachen. One of the scholars, Alcuin, invented a new easier-to-read script called the Carolingian script, which soon became the universal standard in Europe. Weaving and unweaving the Battle of Hastings, the Bayeux Tapestry. In 1066, William the Bastard, the Duke of Normandy, got a new name, William the Conqueror. All he had to do to shed his nasty nickname was conquer England. After overrunning the Saxons at the Battle of Hastings, no one called William the Bastard again. His new name concealed his illegitimacy. William's mother was a commoner's daughter whom his father, Duke Robert I of Normandy, never married. After Will grabbed the English throne, his half-brother Bishop Odo commissioned a Saxon artist to celebrate William the Conqueror's victory on cloth. The result is the 231-foot-long Bayeux Tapestry, which chronicles the Battle of Hastings and events leading up to it from a Norman point of view, providing a battle blueprint. At the Battle of Hastings, William and his forces faced the newly crowned English King Harold and his veteran Saxon troops, called Housecarls. Harold had been under King of England for 13 years, second only to King Edward the Confessor. When Edward died, several men contended for the English throne, including his Norman cousin William the Bastard and Harold Godwin's son, the Under-King. Edward the Confessor is said to have thrown his support to Harold on his deathbed. The English barons proclaimed Harold king. But William the Bastard insisted that the king had promised him the throne several years earlier. The tapestry illustrates why William believed he was the legitimate heir, and how William's Norman cavalry defeated Harold's army in a vicious 10-hour battle that changed English and world history forever. The Bayeux Tapestry isn't really a tapestry or weaving, but an embroidery. The story of the Norman conquest is stitched on linen cloth using two techniques that can be compared to crayoning in a child's coloring book. The stem or outline stitch is used to draw the contours of shapes and to write text. The laid-uncouched method is used for filling or coloring in areas within the outlines, people's clothes and hair, buildings, trees, shields, the flesh of horses, and so on. The actual stitching was done by highly skilled Saxon women, portraying everyday life in medieval England and France. The Bayeux Tapestry is one of the only surviving secular artworks of the period. As such, it offers a wealth of details about medieval life in England and France. It reveals medieval customs, armor, weaponry, and war craft. It also tells us what people ate, and how they dressed and wore their hair. Turns out, the Normans shaved the backs of their heads and the Saxons had early Beatles-style haircuts and handlebar mustaches. In Figure 10.1, the Normans feast before going into battle. Notice the men on the left use arrows to skewer cooked chickens. Another man blows the dinner horn in the ear of the man on his left. To the right, dinner has ended and William, his half-brother Bishop Odo, and his brother Robert planned the battle. Figure 10.1, the scene from the Bayeux Tapestry depicts the feast before the battle. Eric Lessing, Art Resource, New York. Peddling political propaganda. Art is sometimes used as propaganda, and the Bayeux Tapestry appears to be an example of this. The Bayeux Tapestry may be Norman propaganda, designed to justify a foreign duke's conquest of England. One episode in the tapestry shows Harold's coronation. At the left of the newly crowned king stands Stigand, the Archbishop of Canterbury, to anoint the king and legitimize the proceedings. But Archbishop Stigand wasn't legitimate himself. He'd been excommunicated by Pope Nicholas II, but he still had his job. He refused to resign. According to Saxon sources, Stigand didn't even attend Harold's coronation. Harold wasn't about to let an excommunicated archbishop crown him. Instead, the Archbishop of York performed the ceremony, but he doesn't appear anywhere in the tapestry's coronation scene. The reliable English monk and chronicler Florence of Worcester wrote, "When was entombed, the under-king, Harold, son of Earl Godwin, whom the king had chosen before his demise as successor to the kingdom, was elected by the primates of all England to the dignity of kingship, and was consecrated king with due ceremony by Ealdred, Archbishop of York, on the same day." Including the excommunicated bishop in the tapestry was a vital piece of propaganda for William. It helped him justify his claim and won him papal support before the conquest. In fact, Pope Alexander II gave William the papal banner to carry into battle and a ring containing a relic of St. Peter. This recast William's war of aggression into a holy crusade in the eyes of many contemporaries. William won the PR war before the battle even started. Making border crossings. Some scholars believe the borders of the Bayeux Tapestry are merely a decorative frame, like the margins of an illuminated manuscript. Others think they tell the Lozers' side of the story in code. After all, a Norman commissioned the design. But most scholars believe an Anglo-Saxon artist designed it and Anglo-Saxon needleworkers carried out the work. Obviously, the designer had to report the story that Bishop Odo recounted in the main sections of the tapestry. But he appears to have had a free hand in the borders. Did he sneak in Anglo-Saxon propaganda to counter the Norman view of history? If so, he had to be secretive about it. William didn't like negative publicity. Some of the border areas contain Latin fables, animal stories with morals, by the 1st century writer Phaedrus. The bad behavior of the animals in these cartoons may mirror the actions of some of the Normans in the main body of the tapestry. They may hint at an alternative interpretation of events. Scholars are still trying to extract the meanings of the border designs. Romanesque architecture, churches that squat. Viking raids petered out in the mid-11th century, probably because most Scandinavian states had been Christianized. Europe was safer than it had been in centuries. Trade picked up and the standard of living rose throughout Europe. During this relatively peaceful period, towns and cities groomed themselves, launching ambitious building projects on a scale Europe hadn't seen since the fall of Rome. Naturally, they turned to Rome for inspiration. They didn't have to look far. The Roman Empire left its stamp everywhere. Aqueducts, triumphal arches, and other Roman structures peppered the continent. The inventors of the new style borrowed the Roman arch, barrel-vaulted and groin-vaulted ceilings, and the solid masonry walls and ceilings you can see in Roman arenas. Before this time, medieval church roofs were constructed of wood, but they caught fire easily in the candlelit world of the Middle Ages. The new style with vaulted stone roofs is fittingly called Romanesque. The Romanesque rage was also inspired by religion. The 10th through 12th centuries were the great age of pilgrimages to Jerusalem, Rome, and Santiago de Compostela in northwestern Spain. The many arteries to Santiago naturally passed through France. Hundreds of thousands of pilgrims traveled these roads annually on their way to Santiago. Traditional churches were too small to hold them. To meet the growing tourist traffic, large pilgrimage churches were built on the roads to Santiago. But the style spread beyond the Santiago route into Germany, Italy, and England. The French monk chronicler Raoul Glaber said, "It was as if the whole earth were clothing itself in a white robe of churches." Saint Sernin. One of the grandest Romanesque cathedrals is the pilgrimage church of Saint Sernin in Toulouse, which honors the first bishop of Toulouse, Sernin, who was martyred on the spot. According to local tradition, Sernin was tied to the tail of a wild bull and dragged to his death. The name of the street in front of the church is Rue du Tour, which means Street of the Bull. Built between 1060 and 1118 on the road of St. James, Saint Sernin is the largest Romanesque cathedral in Europe. This roomy structure was made to handle crowds. Like most Romanesque churches, Saint Sernin has a cruciform or cross-shaped structure. The tower that rises from the center or heart of the cross suggests Christ's resurrection. Small semicircular chapels bud out of the apse of the cathedral and serve as repositories for holy relics. The biggest change from earlier church designs is the addition of an extra aisle wrapping around the nave and altar. This ambulatory allowed pilgrims access to the relics without disturbing Mass. The church became a round-the-clock pilgrimage destination while still holding masses, weddings, funerals, and other services. Figure 10.2, the cruciform or cross form, is the traditional L shape of medieval cathedrals. St. Sernin's most impressive feature is its tunnel-like nave, the area that begins on the west end of the cruciform church. The two-story high nave is topped by a barrel-vaulted ceiling whose weight is transferred from the arches to the piers or square pillars, which have to be very thick to hold it up. The two levels of arches on the sides help open up the space, while harmonizing with the tunnel of ribs at right angles to them. The long barrel vault has an Emerald City, wizard straight-ahead feel, and leads you irresistibly toward the altar. Because of the enormous weight of the stone ceiling, the cathedral walls had to be thick. Large windows reduce the wall area, and wall area is needed for support, so Romanesque cathedrals had to have small windows. Durham Cathedral. William the Conqueror brought the new Romanesque style to England. He'd promised Pope Alexander II that he would reform the Anglo-Saxon Church of England along papal lines. If he defeated Harold, building new churches was part of his reform package. The huge and impressive structures showed the Saxon majority that their church had been Romanized and was now under the authority of the Pope. The building projects continued after his death in 1087. Durham Cathedral, the masterpiece of Norman architecture, was built in 1093, during the reign of William the Conqueror's son, William II, on the contentious border between England and Scotland. It took only 40 years to complete the gigantic structure, which was breakneck speed in those days. The constant threat of Scottish invasions must have inspired the builders to work fast. Figure 10.3, the nave or parishan area of St. Sernin had to be large to accommodate the endless stream of medieval pilgrims on their way to the shrine of St. James Indiana Santiago de Compostela. Spain. Scala Art Resource, New York. Durham's basic structure is similar to St. Sernin's, but it also has some new architectural elements. Whereas St. Sernin's nave is 2 stories high, Durham's is 3. Large windows let light stream in from the top level. The nave is wider, and the larger nave arches open up the space even more than St. Sernin. The contrasting pillars, compound piers and cylindrical columns add variety and interest. The biggest difference is the ceiling, which features a new vaulting system called a ribbed groin vault with pointed instead of round vaults. 2 modified barrel vaults are spliced together at right angles in this ceiling. Another way to look at it is that the ceiling is comprised of 2 overlapping barrel vaults, neither of them centered. This structure allowed builders to use thinner materials to make the sections of ceiling between the ribs. With a lighter ceiling, the architect was able to cut larger holes in the walls for windows. Durham helped pave the way for the innovative arches and vaults of Gothic architecture. Romanesque churches had a dark side, literally. The windows were too small to let in much light. This and the massiveness of the churches made them oppressive rather than uplifting. Some are so gloomy that being in them feels like a penance. The Gothic style fixed that. Romanesque sculpture. Instead of a welcome mat, reliefs of the Last Judgment grimly greet visitors to Autun Cathedral and the Basilica of St. Madeleine Cathedral of Vézelay. Most churches displayed scenes of the Last Judgment on the interior back wall of the nave so that, on their way out, people would be reminded of the price for committing sin. Why these 2 pilgrim churches on the road of St. James chose to put such a menacing story at their entrances remains a mystery. Figure 10.4. The tympanum over the entrance doors of the Basilica of St. Madeleine, a pilgrimage church in Vézelay, depicts a medieval vision of the Last Judgment. Jesse Bryant Wilder. Nightmares in Stone, Romanesque Relief. The front door Last Judgment relief at the Basilica of St. Madeleine appears on the tympanum. Christ dominates the scene by his placement and exaggerated size. His stylized expression of openness invites everyone to come to him and to enter the church. However, on the sides of the top and middle registers, 4 angels blow the trumpets of the Last Judgment. The top register represents heaven, the middle represents life on earth, and the bottom level is reserved for the dead. Notice that the angels on the top level sound their trumpets to those on earth, while the angels on the middle band blow their horns to waken the dead. On Jesus's left, an angel and devil operate the judgment scales. On the viewer's far right, a demon, representing the mouth of hell, swallows the damned. Just below the scales, a devil lifts one of the dead up to be weighed. On the other side of the bottom band, children cling to an angel, hoping to enter heaven. Above them in the land of the living, a similar scene plays out. Some people poke their heads out of their windows to check out Judgment Day. Such scenes must have encouraged many people to mend their ways. Roman sculpture revival. Since the fall of the Roman Empire, sculptors had virtually stopped making large-scale sculpture in the round. Romanesque artists revived the tradition, but in their own way. The earliest examples of large-scale sculpture appear on the road to Santiago in southwestern France and northern Spain. Perhaps they were inspired by ruins of freestanding Roman sculptures. The Apostle, carved in about 1090 for the pilgrim church of Saint Sernin in Toulouse, is reminiscent of Roman statues, even though he's stuck in a niche. The solidness of the statue, the cut of and folds in his garment, and his expression and stance look like a simplification of a Roman statue like the Augustus Prima Porta. Crusades, a Middle Ages crisis. The first 3 crusades were organized to rescue Jerusalem from its Muslim conquerors, guarantee the safety of Christian pilgrims journeying to the Holy Land, provide land and booty to landless second sons of nobles, unite Christendom under the Pope's authority, defend the Byzantine Empire from Muslim incursions, and end the schism between the Eastern and Western churches. None of these goals was achieved over the long term. The First Crusade did reach and conquer Jerusalem in 1099, mercilessly massacring the Muslim and Jewish residents, and even the women and children. Crusader states were established in Jerusalem, Antioch, Tripoli, and Edessa. But within 88 years, the Muslims reconquered Edessa, Tripoli, and Jerusalem. Antioch fell in 1268. The Great Wave of Arabic contributions to Western culture. The Crusades and Reconquista brought Western Europeans in contact with the far more advanced cultures of the East. This contact changed the West forever. It led to increased trade with the East, stimulating European economies and the development of money and banking. It breathed new life into art, literature, music, and architecture, and spawned a new inquisitiveness about the natural sciences. Islamic translators in Baghdad, Iraq, and Córdoba, Spain, translated into Arabic all the surviving works of classical Greece, as well as works of Indian literature written in Sanskrit. Later these works were translated, often directly from the Arabic, into Latin, helping to keep the flame of classical knowledge alive. Without the Arabic translations, some Greek masterpieces would have been lost forever. The influence of the 2 greatest medieval Arab thinkers, Avicenna and Averroes, was enormous. Avicenna's Canon of Medicine, which was taught in European universities for about 500 years, is the foundation for Western medicine. Books by Averroes, who argued that reason was more important than faith in the quest for truth, were taught in Europe until the 17th century. His famous commentaries on Aristotle influenced the leading medieval philosophers, including Albertus Magnus and St. Thomas Aquinas. Dante and Chaucer praise both men in the Divine Comedy and Canterbury Tales, respectively. Relics and reliquaries, miraculous leftovers. As modern rock fans might trek to Graceland to tour Elvis's home or see one of his Vegas jumpsuits, medieval Christians journeyed hundreds and even thousands of miles to be close to the bones or belongings of saints. They believed some of a saint's virtue remained in his bones or clothes after death. This leftover virtue was supposedly powerful enough to produce miracles. The most potent relics could purportedly protect entire kingdoms. To protect relics, Romanesque-era artists preserved them in sealed, often silver-gilt reliquaries that resembled the relic, arm reliquaries for arm bones, foot reliquaries for feet, even head reliquaries for heads. In this way, pilgrims knew what body part they were worshipping without actually seeing it. In later centuries, peepholes were added so pilgrims could glimpse the bone or body part. After walking hundreds of miles, most people wanted to see more than a pretty reliquary. Late Gothic reliquaries make it even easier to see the relic, often by placing it in a carved rock quartz casing. Gothic grandeur, churches that soar. Abbot Suger is credited with being the inventor of Gothic architecture. Yet he wasn't even an architect. How did he do it? To answer that question, you need to know a little bit about feudalism. Feudalism is a socio-political system in which a powerful man like a king grants land, a fief, and his protection to a less powerful man. In exchange, the vassal pledges his loyalty and military service to his lord. A lord might have 100 or 200 vassals, who in turn have their own network of vassals. At the bottom of this social scale were serfs, peasants who were attached to the land as if they were part of the property. Feudalism peaked in the 11th and 12th centuries. During the first half of the 12th century, the King of France ruled only the area around Paris, which is called the Elite France. King Louis VII was weaker than many of his vassals. To help Louis strengthen his hand and knit the rest of France to the crown, his advisor, Abbot Suger, recommended a church and state alliance, which would compel the counts, dukes, and bishops to submit to both God and king, at least in theory. The glue of this alliance was an architecture project, the rebuilding of the Royal Abbey Church of Saint Denis, which is just north of Paris. Saint Denis is the patron saint of France. According to legend, he chose the site for the Royal Abbey of Saint Denis himself, after being decapitated. The trunk of Saint Denis supposedly stooped down to retrieve his head, and then carried it 7 miles, from Montmartre to the town known today as Street Denis. When he arrived, he deposited the head on the spot where he wanted his church built. Then he collapsed and died. A few centuries later the first church was built on that location, or so the legend goes. Saint Denis's relics are in residence in the church to this day. Saint Denis is the resting place of many of France's early kings. Charles Martel, Pepin the Short and Charles the Bold are interred there. Charlemagne and Pepin the Short were anointed kings at Saint Denis. In the 12th century, the Royal Abbey Church of Saint Denis symbolized France. But it didn't look the part. Abbot Suger felt it needed a facelift, something that would announce to everyone that France was about to be reborn. Bigger and brighter. Suger wanted the Abbey Church to mirror the glory of the monarchy and God. But the church was too small to reflect such a grand vision. In his book Ordinator, Suger describes the unruly crowds of visiting pilgrims who poured into the church on holy days to be near the relics of Saint Denis or visit the tombs of France's early kings. You could see how people grievously trod down one another. How? Eager little women struggled to advance toward the altar, marching upon the heads of the men as upon a pavement. The Abbey Church's other shortcoming was that it was too dark. Basically, Suger wanted bigger, brighter churches. He believed that God is light, so churches should be filled with radiance, not Romanesque gloom. He believed that the colored light that filters through stained glass or reflects off the gems and chalices and monstrances transports people into a mystical world of the spirit. 4. Suger, beautiful art was a materialistic highway into the spiritual world, a pathway to God. Making something new from old parts. How big and bright could Suger make the Abbey Church of Saint Denis, given its Romanesque frame? If he enlarged the windows too much, the roof would cave in. To solve the problem, Suger invited many of the best architects in Europe to Paris. Their mutual solution was to cobble together innovations from Romanesque churches like pointed arches, ribbed groin vaults, and flying buttresses, and merge them into a single structure. No Romanesque church included all these elements. Before enlarging the windows, the designers had to redistribute the church's weight. This was achieved with ribbed groin vaults and flying buttresses placed against the outside walls of the church. To understand how flying buttresses work, picture a row of strong guys or gals, each straight-arming the church, as if to hold it up. Their arms are the semi-arches, or butts of the buttresses, and their bodies are the buttress verticals. How does ribbed vaulting work? The ribs of each vault, which look like a rib cage or the inside spokes of an umbrella, channel the weight from the vault to the walls, where the flying buttresses counter or neutralize it. Figure 10.5, flying buttresses or external supports, like those shown in this illustration, help hold up the massive roof of the Abbey Church of Saint Denis, the first Gothic cathedral. Figure 10.6, Saint Denis's ribbed vaulting, like that shown in this illustration, transfers the weight of the roof to the external flying buttresses. Because the flying buttresses do much of the wall's work, the walls can be opened up with large windows. For the first time in history, a monumentally large, closed building could be flooded with natural light. Suger's achievement must have seemed miraculous. Finishing touches and voila! Suger added a necklace of chapels around the east end of the church so, the wonderful and uninterrupted light of most luminous windows pervade the interior beauty of the choir and altar. The east end of the Romanesque Cathedral of Saint Sernin is similarly circuited by a ring of small chapels. Abbot Suger rededicated the Royal Abbey Church of St. Denis on June 11, 1144 in the presence of King Louis VII and his queen, Eleanor of Aquitaine. Expanding the Gothic dream. The Gothic style spread from St. Denis to the rest of France. In 1163, construction began on Notre Dame. Between 1170 and 1270, the French erected more than 500 Gothic churches. Among the greatest are Chartres, Reims, Amiens, and Sainte-Chapelle. During this period, architects became more daring, building taller cathedrals, streamlining the stone piers and buttresses to maximize efficiency, and reducing the walls to expanses of stained glass. The buildings become more skeletal and gravity-defying. By 1243, the walls had all but disappeared and had been replaced by acres of stained glass. Figure 10.7, Notre Dame in Paris is the most famous Gothic cathedral in the world. Jesse Bryant Wilder. During the next 200 years, the Gothic style spread across all Europe and beyond. Like Romanesque, it was an international style born in France. Some of the most outstanding Gothic cathedrals are Salisbury Cathedral in Salisbury, England, Cologne Cathedral in Cologne, Germany, St. Stephen's Indiana Vienna, Austria, St. Vitus in Prague, Czech Republic. The French style stayed largely intact in most countries, with some regional variations. But in Italy, Byzantine and Roman influences greatly modified the style. Stained glass storytelling. In 1194, the city of Chartres and its Romanesque cathedral burned. The townspeople were crushed. Not only had they lost their homes and church, but more importantly, they lost their prize relic, the Sancta Comitia. 3 days later, the relic turned up, undamaged. It seemed like a miracle, but in fact, when the fire started, a resourceful priest hid it in the cathedral crypt. A visiting cardinal, addressing the relieved citizens, said the recovery of the relic was a sign from Mary. She wanted a bigger church. The crowd erupted with enthusiasm. Donations soon poured in for the new cathedral. Although he was at war with France, Richard the Lionheart, King of England, let English priests collect money for the reconstruction. Not to be outdone, the French king, Philip Auguste, paid for the cathedral's elaborate north porch. Because the cathedral was to be built in the new Gothic style, many people donated stained glass windows. French guild workers donated 43 stained glass windows, each guild signing its work with an image depicting its trade. Nobles often signed the windows they donated with their coats of arms. The blazonry of France. The fleur-de-lis is part of the elaborate pattern of the North Rose window of Chartres, donated about 40 years later by the new French queen, Blanche of Castile, the granddaughter of Eleanor of Aquitaine and the mother of St. Louis. The kaleidoscope patterns of the rose window are an exercise in theme and variation of shape, symbol, and color. Each of the clock-like, concentric rings is comprised of 12 repeated shapes. The outer semicircles feature 12 Hebrew prophets. The postage stamp figures in the middle ring are 12 kings of Judah. Mary and the Christ child sit in the center. Beneath the rose, 5 lancet windows frame Hebrew, Babylonian, and Egyptian kings, from Nebuchadnezzar to King Solomon. Other windows and external relief sculpture tell the stories of the Bible from Genesis to the Apocalypse. In those days, the only way most people could read the Bible was through stained glass storytelling and narrative relief. Thanks to Abbot Suger, windows and churches could now be built large enough to recount the entire Bible. Most of France's Gothic stained glass windows were smashed during the French Revolution. The only church with most of its original stained glass is the Cathedral of Chartres. 152 of the original 186 windows survive. Gothic sculpture. Gothic sculpture was inspired by Abbot Suger's innovations at St. Denis. See Gothic grandeur, churches that soar, earlier in this chapter. Unfortunately, much of the St. Denis sculpture has been damaged. But the statues on the west portal of Chartres were carved just 1 year after Suger completed Street Denis and reflect a similar style. The statues are much more realistic than the relief carvings on the tympanum of Vézelay Cathedral, even though those were carved only 10 to 15 years earlier. Figure 10.8, the Jam statues on the west portal. of the Cathedral of Chartres stand in a pose that is determined by the column, as if they were an extension of it. Gloria Wilder. The cigar-shaped statues that sentinel each of the three doors were made to fit the columns, which almost appear to be their backbones. Their long legs still have a Romanesque rigidity, but the clothing and faces are much more realistic. Instead of the wild, nightmarish look of the Vézelay tympanum, these statues have a quiet dignity that befits their stature as Old Testament kings, queens, and prophets. The west doors are also known as the Royal Portal. 40 years later, during the church's reconstruction after the 1194 fire, the Gothic style had moved even closer to realism. The statues on the south transept doors, or south portal, look like people you might meet on the streets of Paris or Chartres if you could beam back in time. The figures are still dignified like those on the Royal Portal, but their dignity no longer conceals their individuality. These figures are much nearer to being freestanding statues than their Royal Portal counterparts. The column supports seem like crutches that the statues could walk away from to share a draught of mead with you in a local café. The statue of Saint Theodore dressed as a contemporary crusader on the left is the most naturalistic. Notice the round contours of the flesh under his left arm and the naturalistic manner in which he grips his lance. Figure 10-9. The South Portal statues have a much more realistic look than the older jam statues on the Royal or West Portal. John Garton. Italian Gothic. In Italy, the transplanted Gothic or French style took on a distinctly Italian flavor. Italian Gothic cathedrals look nothing like French cathedrals. There is more than a hint of Byzantine splendor and Italian love of color in Siena Cathedral, which may be the most sumptuous church in Europe, from its inlaid marble floors, which Giorgio Vasari called the most beautiful, great and magnificent pavement ever made, to the stellar beauty of its star-spangled, rib-vaulted ceiling, created to suggest heaven. Siena Cathedral took several centuries to complete. I focus here on the Gothic part, which was built in the 13th and 14th centuries, beginning in 1215. Like many Italian churches, Siena Cathedral has a dome and bell tower, but it lacks the soaring spires associated with the French style. What it fails to achieve in height, it makes up for in decoration. Giovanni Pisano designed the bottom half of the dazzling facade and sculpted its superb statues between 1284 and 1296. Giovanni Pisano had assisted his famous father, Nicola Pisano, 20 years earlier in creating the cathedral's magnificent Carrara marble pulpit. At the time, Giovanni was in his early 20s. Pisano framed the three front doors with elaborate polychrome marbles, some of which are striped like candy canes. The columns have Corinthian-style capitals and appear to arc into the lunettes above them. The pediments above the lunettes each enclose a from torso to head bust. Just above the outside pediments, Pisano sculpted the four evangelists of the Gospels in pairs, Mark and Luke to the viewer's left, Matthew and John to the right. Each apostle stands next to his animal symbol. Each, except John, holds the gospel he wrote. The interior of Siena Cathedral is a visual feast. There's almost too much to look at. But in spite of the abundance of decoration and sculpture, it has an overarching unity. The rib-vaulted ceiling and the colonnades of arches dividing the nave from the aisles are influenced by French Gothic. Together they create a glorious architectural harmony. The inlays on the inside of the arches, the black and white marble piers, and the 36 busts of Christian emperors beneath the two imposing rows of 176 popes are all uniquely Italian features. The rose window on the opposite end of the cathedral was based on a design by Duccio. Gothic painting, Cimabue, Duccio, and Giotto. The Knights of the Fourth Crusade never reached their destination, Egypt. They got sidetracked into attacking Constantinople, their ally. The Crusaders crushed the Eastern Roman Empire, which, until then, seemed eternal. The one positive result of the Crusaders' occupation of Constantinople was that many Byzantine artists fled the city and emigrated to Italy, bringing Eastern cultural influences with them. Italians called this influence the Greek manner. The Greek manner mixed with the relatively new Gothic style that seeped into Italy from the north. The melding of the two gave birth to a revolutionary style of painting that paved the way for the Renaissance. This style was more than the sum of its parts. Although the component parts were French Gothic and Byzantine or Greek, the new style had a decidedly Italian flair. The three greatest masters of this new style are Cimabue, Duccio, and Giotto. Cimabue. Madonna enthroned by Cimabue has many of the same generic features that Byzantine icons have. These features include standardized folds in the garments, as if they'd all been pressed by the same dry cleaner. Gold, plate-size halos, identical poses and gestures clone like angels. A flat, decorative background. In other words, Madonna enthroned has the same hand-me-down composition. But there are subtle differences. Cimabue's faces, especially those in the bottom register, are fuller, fleshier, and much more expressive. These differences are more pronounced in Cimabue's Madonna in Majesty fresco, painted for the Basilica of St. Francis Indiana Assisi about 50 years after St. Francis's death. The Madonna in Majesty has an intimacy that Byzantine icons lack. Icon paintings are meant to be aloof, because they depict divine beings who might raise a hand in the viewer's direction and make eye contact, but who remain from another world. The flesh of the figures is fleshy. They're more realistic than Byzantine icons. The painting has a gentle sadness about it that the blues and greens and Mary's angelic prettiness sweeten. All the faces in the fresco seem to reinforce this emotion as if they had the same reaction to something that's not visually stated in the painting. Expressive emotion is one of the unique characteristics of the new style of Italian painting. Figure 1010, Cimabue's serene but damaged Madonna in Majesty adorns the Basilica of St. Francis Indiana Assisi. The fresco has undergone several major restoration ns. Scala Art Resource, New York. On the right side of the painting stands a barefoot St. Francis. He is easy to identify because he bears the stigmata on his hands and feet. Like the angels beside him, Francis looks at the viewer, almost as if he were posing for a photograph. None of them seems to notice the others. Sameness in Byzantine painting is a good thing. Icons are not supposed to change, because the figures they represent are believed to be eternal and unchanging. Byzantines believed that the first icons of Christ and the Virgin Mary were painted by St. Luke, so later artists, in a sense, copy from those originals. Also, Byzantine art is meant to depict the spiritual side of the figure, not the sensual side, so fleshiness or three-dimensionality was off-limits to Byzantine artists. 30 years after Cimabue painted the fresco, part of it was destroyed. Saint Anthony formerly stood on the left side of the painting, balancing the image of Saint Francis. Cennino Cennini's Craftsmanshandbuch. In the late 1390s, a Florentine painter named Cennino Cennini wrote a guidebook that gave instructions in medieval painting techniques. Cennino wasn't the greatest painter of his day, but his handbook records time-tested methods of art making from the medieval period. The book reveals that wood panels had to be installed in elaborately carved and decorated frames before the painter got a crack at them. Then a craftsman brushed the panel surface with gesso many times and afterward sanded it smooth. Next, he mixed a red earth pigment, called bole, with the glue and brushed it onto the areas where gold leaf would be applied. If the craftsman placed the gold leaf directly on the tan gesso, it would look greenish and sickly, whereas, with the reddish underlayer, it glowed with a golden warmth. Next he sketched in the contours of the figures and then stamped ornate halo designs onto the gold background with special tools. Finally, he cracked a few eggs, extracted the yolks, and mixed them with tempera pigment to create the paints. Because egg tempera dries quickly, most medieval artists mixed their colors as they worked by painting tiny strokes of one color next to the dry strokes of a neighboring color, hoping that, from a distance, they would appear to mix to the desired hue of the saint's robe or whatever they were painting. Cimabue painted Madonna in Majesty between 1278 and 1280. Saint Francis died in 1226. According to local Assisi tradition, Cimabue captured the true likeness of St. Francis Indiana this painting, even though he never saw the saint. Like a police artist making a composite sketch, Cimabue supposedly reconstructed St. Francis's face by gathering accounts of his appearance from people who knew him. Duccio. At first glance, Madonna enthroned by Duccio also mimics Byzantine icon painting, the Greek manner. But on closer inspection, you can see a three-dimensionality that's missing from icon paintings. The faces have contours, angles, areas of shadow and light, and a hint of personality. Notice that Mary's right hand is more natural-looking here than it is in Cimabue's Madonna enthroned. The two pairs of bare feet on the right and left sides of the painting are also fleshed out and real. They don't wear the same size shoes. The cloaks on the figures fall more fluidly. The contours of Mary's right knee and leg press naturalistically through the fabric. You can see the same naturalism in the Gothic statue of Saint Theodore on the south portal of Chartres. These differences reflect the French Gothic side of Duccio. In this painting, Duccio seems to have found a perfect balance between Gothic elegance and Byzantine formality. But in Italy, the scales soon tipped toward naturalism and a revival of Western Empire classicism. Giotto. According to Renaissance biographer Giorgio Vasari, Giotto became Cimabue's pupil after the older artist saw the boy sketching some grazing sheep. He recognized the 10-year-old's talent at once. In 1550, Vasari wrote, "The child not only equaled the manner of his master, but became so good an imitator of nature that he banished completely that rude Greek manner and revived the modern and good art of painting." Like Cimabue, Giotto was practically a Florentine. Although Giotto appears to have been Cimabue's student, he was a much greater or at least more original artist than his master. Apparently, Cimabue liked sticking to the Byzantine tradition as long as he could mix it with a little Gothic realism. What made Giotto unique was that he didn't copy from others, he copied from nature. Giotto was a great observer. He noticed life's details and included them in his art. His religious paintings give the impression that you're watching the actual events through a hidden camera. Some figures in his paintings turn their backs on you, as they might in real life. Others stand in front of the people around them, blocking their faces or part of their bodies from view. Byzantine artists would never do this, the formulas for icon paintings wouldn't allow it. Giotto's ability to capture feeling in a multitude of situations makes his work revolutionary and refreshing. There is an emotional intensity in his frescoes that hadn't been seen before, not only in the expressiveness of the faces, but in the dramatic lighting that bathes the figures. In The Kiss of Judas, Giotto creates an electrifying drama, heightened by the thicket of spears, torches, and shepherd staffs, wielded by the combatants. All the explosive tension in the painting converges on the kiss, as Jesus and Judas square off. Giotto's paintings have a cinematic quality, especially the Arena Chapel fresco series in Padua, which is considered to be his greatest work. Instead of posing for the viewer, as if someone were about to snap their picture, the people in the frescoes look at each other directly or out of the corners of their eyes. They interact and communicate with one another instead of posing. Figure 1011. In The Kiss of Judas, Giotto dramatizes Christ's betrayal by depicting the clash between Jesus' supporters and enemies. Scala Art Resource, New York. In The Flight into Egypt, notice how the Virgin Mary and the woman leading the donkey study Joseph as he guides them through the desert. The Christ child observes a woman behind the donkey who is talking to her companion. Everyone has his or her eyes on someone. The interplay of glances tells a very human story. True, the background trees look like magazine cutouts pasted onto the mountains. But Giotto was interested in people. His painting revolution took place in the foreground, not the background. Giotto's people inhabit not only the same scene, like the figures in Cimabue's and Duccio's works, but they occupy the same psychological space. This is the first time in art that people in a painting ignore the viewer and focus on each other. Tracking the Lady and the Unicorn, the mystical tapestries of Cluny. Tapestries woven of wool and silk threads and gold and silver wires were very fashionable among the rich in the 14th and 15th centuries. They hindered drafts and beautified drab castle walls. The reason so few exist today is that, in later centuries, people burned them to extract the gold and silver wires. Medieval tapestries usually recounted allegorical stories meant to illustrate courtly love, chivalry, or religious themes. Perhaps the most famous tapestries are the Six Lady and the Unicorn tapestries, created for Jean Le Viste in the late 15th century. The tapestries now hang in the Musée de Cluny in Paris. The Lady and the Unicorn cycle is done in the popular Millefleur style, in which hundreds of floating flowers sift through the tapestry background like confetti. The background is intended to represent a field of flowers, often populated by playful animals, but the ground is so steeply pitched that both the flowers and the animals appear to be levitating. At first glance, The Lady and the Unicorn doesn't seem to have a courtly love theme. There are no men in any of the 6 tapestries. But a male presence is implied. The lady seems to be wistfully thinking of an absent lover. Perhaps the unicorn is a kind of stand-in for him. 5 of the Lady and the Unicorn tapestries represent the senses. Today we refer to them as touch, taste, sight, hearing, and smell. The 6th and most mysterious tapestry seems to be about love and desire, yielding to it or renouncing it. The words Aimant Seul Désir are emblazoned on the canopy of the blue tent in the center of the tapestry. In the other tapestries, the lady wears a richly jeweled necklace, possibly a gift from a lover. In Aimant Seul Désir, she either returns or takes the necklace from her jewelry box. Is she renouncing love or getting ready for a date? In the tapestries of the senses, the lady tames or seduces a wild unicorn. In pre-Christian legends, only a virgin can tame the erotic beast by resting its phallic horn between her breasts. This racy tale was edited in the Middle Ages. In the Christian period, only a virgin could catch and tame a unicorn. Christians also believed that the animal's horn would purify whatever it touched. Dipping a unicorn horn into a polluted stream could clean the water. They further updated the legend by linking the unicorn to the Virgin Mary. In medieval art, often a unicorn is shown resting its head on the Virgin's lap or touching her lap with its hoof, as it does in the Sight tapestry, shown in the color section. The infant Jesus also sat in Mary's lap and purified whatever he touched, so unicorns became symbols of Christ's incarnation as well. Is the lady who tames the unicorn a substitute for the Virgin Mary? Is she a virgin who wants to be something else or a virgin who wants to transcend the world of the senses forever? Or is she an experienced woman who wishes she could have her innocence back? Or do the tapestries represent the seasons of a woman's life? These are questions no one can answer, which is one reason why the tapestries still intrigue people after 500 years. Many people believe the Lady and the Unicorn tapestries are about a woman renouncing the sensual world for a contemplative or spiritual life. This was not uncommon in the Middle Ages. Many women and men retired from the world of the senses to join one of the many religious orders: Franciscans, Poor Clares, Dominicans, Carthusians. In Touch, the lady holds the unicorn gently by the horn, suggesting that she has tamed him. But there may be another level of meaning. Does holding the unicorn's horn mean the lady has mastered her desire or been mastered by it? Is she renouncing the sense of touch or yielding to it? Maybe the answer is in her faraway eyes, which suggest she longs for something she can no longer have. All the animals in the tapestry, except the monkey on the upper left, seem to serve or be controlled by the lady. Notice that the monkey is chained up. There's no place for monkey business in the Touch tapestry. But in the other tapestries, he's unleashed and sometimes behaves mischievously, sniffing a rose or chomping on a nut or morsel of candy the lady drops. Chapter 11. Born-Again Culture, the Early and High Renaissance. In this chapter, exploring Renaissance ideals, making sense of rationalist architecture, tracking vanishing points and reading narrative paintings, decrypting the visual poetry of Botticelli standing up with Donatello, soaring into the High Renaissance with Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael. The Renaissance is the rebirth or reawakening of Greek and Roman culture, which in 1400 had been dozing for almost 1,000 years. What sent classical culture into hibernation? When Rome fell, many Christians turned their backs on classical culture, which they associated with paganism. For the next 1,000 years, artists focused on God and the afterlife, instead of celebrating the sensual earthly life as the Romans and Greeks had. But the past wasn't completely forgotten. Poets like Dante and Chaucer mentioned Greek myths on occasion, and Romanesque architecture revived elements of Roman architecture in the 11th and early 12th centuries. During the Renaissance, classical culture made nearly a complete comeback. Artists resurrected realism in painting and sculpture, and classical literature, history, and philosophy inspired writers from Niccolò Machiavelli to William Shakespeare and Jean Racine. Even the Greco-Roman gods reappeared, showing up in art nearly as often as Christian saints. That doesn't mean artists converted to paganism. They became down-to-earth Christians, focusing on the here and now as much as the hereafter. The early Renaissance in central Italy. Most historians believe that the city of Florence gave birth to the Renaissance in the 15th century. But the new movement had its roots in the preceding century, especially in the art of the Florentine Giotto, who had given flesh a three-dimensional look for the first time since the fall of Rome. However, Giotto's perspective was intuitive and imprecise, not mathematical. Consequently, his paintings have a shallow depth of field, the figures tend to hover in the foreground. Building on Giotto's achievements, artists of the early Renaissance invented a precise science of perspective to give their artwork infinite depth. During the Renaissance, looking at a painting was like peering through a window at the real world, with some objects close and others far. The Great Door Contest, Brunelleschi vs. Ghiberti, and the winner is. In a way, a door-making contest launched the Renaissance in 1401. Florence was about to be gobbled up by Milan. The power-hungry Duke of Milan had already conquered Siena and Perugia. Florence was next on his hit list. The Duke intended to rule all of Italy, which was a fractured country of independent city-states. Despite the impending danger, Florence's leaders decided to sponsor a door-making contest instead of investing all their civic energy into strengthening their defenses. The doors of the Florentine baptistry were very important to Florence. 70 years earlier, the sculptor Andrea Pisano had cast two of the baptistry doors in gilded bronze with scenes from the life of St. John the Baptist, the city's patron saint. Now city leaders wanted two more bronze doors. The year 1402 turned out to be a good one for Florence and the Renaissance. The Duke of Milan died of the plague and Florence was saved. Also, the winner of the door contest was announced, Lorenzo Ghiberti. The Renaissance was underway. 3 of the other 7 contestants also became pioneers of the Renaissance, spreading it in other directions: Donatello, Jacopo della Quercia, and Filippo Brunelleschi. Ghiberti's bronze doors so dazzled Florentines that the city invited him to make 2 more doors. He did. The second set perfectly illustrated scientific perspective, and so impressed the young Michelangelo that he dubbed them the Gates of Paradise. After failing to win the door contest, Brunelleschi gave up sculpture and became an architect. He probably made a trip to Rome not long after the contest with his friend the sculptor Donatello to study Roman architecture. Using classical models like the Pantheon and Colosseum, Brunelleschi invented Renaissance architecture, a geometrical style of grace, harmony, and openness. The Duomo of Florence. 16 years after the door contest, Brunelleschi competed against Ghiberti again to design a dome for the Duomo of Florence. This time he won. The Duomo had a wooden roof, it needed a stone one. But the massive Gothic structure seemed too huge to cap with a stone dome. Instead of constructing a single solid mass, which would have been too heavy, Brunelleschi solved the problem by designing a double masonry shell, each reinforcing the other. The double shell rested on a massive drum, rather than the roof. Thanks to this ingenious method, Brunelleschi was able to construct the world's biggest and one of its most majestic domes. The Duomo dome soars 375 feet. Other projects soon came Brunelleschi's way. One of his greatest achievements was his design for the ruling Medici family's church, San Lorenzo. With its Corinthian columns, Roman arches, and classical harmony, San Lorenzo feels as much like a pagan temple as a Christian church. Because Brunelleschi used proportional ratios and geometric shapes, the building conveys a sense of rational order, grace, and serenity. Gothic cathedrals soar toward heaven and seem to lift visitors beyond themselves. But the cubical interior of San Lorenzo with its flat, coffered ceiling doesn't draw anyone skyward. The space feels self-contained, but at the same time open, not boxy. The relationships of arches at different angles and levels and roundels in a rectangular space creates an architectural harmony. Above all, the space conveys a sense of rational order rather than religious ecstasy, inspiring visitors to think about God rather than swoon over him. What's the point? The fathers of perspective. Things appear to shrink as they recede into the distance. Watch someone walking down a straight road, and eventually, she'll disappear. But at what rate does she shrink? At 100 yards away, how much shorter is she than she was when she was standing next to you? Artists had to guess until Brunelleschi invented linear perspective, which his friend Leone Battista Alberti described in his book De Pictura in 1435. The main feature of linear perspective is the vanishing point. You know, railroad tracks are parallel, yet they appear to converge as they recede into the distance. In one-point perspective, the lines on each side of a painting gradually converge like railroad tracks. By drawing railroad tracks from the tops and bottoms of rectangular buildings on the left and right sides of a painting or drawing, you can determine the correct height of any object between the foreground plane of the painting and the vanishing point. In the following sections, we examine the art and architecture of major early Renaissance and High Renaissance artists and architects. Figure 11.1, Linear perspective. E is an exact science, an object's location determines its size. Masaccio, right from the fish's mouth. Masaccio, one of the greatest painters of the early Renaissance, was the first to apply Brunelleschi's system of perspective to painting. At the age of 21, he was already a master. Unfortunately, he only lived 6 more years. Masaccio's greatest works may be his frescoes of the life of St. Peter Indiana, the Brancacci Chapel in St. Maria del Carmine in Florence. The painting The Tribute Money is a visual narrative with 3 episodes that begin in the center, move to the left, and then backtrack to the right. Only one character, St. Peter, appears in all 3 scenes, dressed in an orange cloak over a blue undergarment. His clothes help the viewer track his movements. Peter's concern about paying tribute money prompts Jesus to say, "Go thou to the sea, and cast an hook, and take up the fish that first cometh up, and when thou hast opened his mouth, thou shalt find a piece of money, that take, and give unto them for me and thee." The baffled looks on the faces of the apostles shows the Renaissance shift in focus from God to man. Although the painting illustrates a biblical passage, Masaccio draws the viewer's attention to the apostles' human reaction to Jesus' strange prediction. Pointing fingers, gestures, and stunned expressions tell the rest of the story. Masaccio's handling of perspective is masterful. Though the figures cluster together in the center of the painting, the ones in the rear of the group shrink convincingly, according to the laws of linear perspective. The background of gloomy gray mountains and sky, though simple, gives the painting a profound sense of depth. Your eyes can wander into the distance in his painting. After Masaccio's early death, painting languished in Florence. Andrea del Castagno, Another Last Supper. For a while, it seemed Andrea del Castagno might fill Masaccio's shoes as the next great Renaissance painter. But like Masaccio, he died young, at the age of 34, from the plague. Castagno's career started when he was a teenager. At 17, the Medici family commissioned him to paint the corpses of rebels hanged for conspiring against Medici rule. The painting has long been lost. One of Castagno's greatest paintings is The Last Supper on the dining hall of the convent of St. Apollonia in Florence. The apostles have even more personality in this fresco than they do in Masaccio's The Tribute Money. But they barely communicate, they seem to be in their own world. Fra Angelico, he's not a liqueur. Fra Angelico's real name was Guido di Pietro. His nickname, which is what most people know him by, means angelic brother. He carried the Renaissance spirit quietly and subtly into the Florentine monastery of San Marco, where he lived as a Dominican monk. With a team of assistants, Fra Angelico covered the walls of the monastery over a 10-year period with frescoes of quiet beauty. The paintings of Fra Angelico are prayers. They have a serene intensity, perfect for spiritual contemplation. Even his fresco The Mocking of Christ, in which disembodied hands harass Jesus, is as calm and peaceful as meditation. You feel as though you're out of reach of the violence, even as it occurs. It can't disrupt the contemplative quiet of the painting or the monastery. Although a man spits at Jesus, the spray never reaches him. Jesus sits erect and calm on a throne that looks almost like a stage for a theater piece, further distancing him from his suffering. At the foot of the platform, St. Dominic thumbs through a book and the Virgin Mary wistfully muses, suggesting that the event is happening in memory rather than the present. Figure 11-2, the floating body parts in the mocking of Christ make it seem almost like a surreal painting. Scala Art Resource, New York. Filippo Lippi, the Wayward Monk. Although he was a monk, too, Fra Filippo Lippi was much less devout than Fra Angelico. Lippi lived a wild life and cavorted with nuns. His masterpiece, Madonna and Child with the Birth of the Virgin, though delicate and beautiful, is stuffed with the details of day-to-day life. Instead of transcending the world, like Fra Angelico's art, Fra Lippi shows the viewer the texture of everyday life, someone running up the steps. Tired women carrying baskets to and fro, a child pulling on his mother's gown. Whereas Masaccio's narrative The Tribute Money combines several instances into rapid succession in one frame, the episodes in Fra Lippi's painting occur many years apart. Yet these events exist simultaneously on different levels, showing their interconnectedness. Jesus' birth is possible only because of Mary's birth, which occurs supernaturally to a barren woman, Saint Anne, and is depicted just behind the adult Mary in the foreground. At the top of the stairs, you can see Saint Anne 9 months prior to the Virgin's birth, getting the good news. Time moves in a circle in this painting, like a clock, leading the viewer from birth to birth, beginning to beginning. The color red helps you navigate the painting, leading your eyes around the circle as they leap from Mary's red garment, to Saint Anne's bedspread, to the drapery above her, to the red shirt of Saint Anne's husband bounding up the stairs. Red also helps to balance this complex composition, as does Lippi's subtle use of perspective. The delicacy that Lippi brings to Renaissance painting, Mary's pale, luminous skin, her transparent veils, and her pretty grace, appear again in the paintings of Lippi's famous student Botticelli and in the paintings of his son Filippino Lippi. Sandro Botticelli, a garden variety Venus. Sandro Botticelli is the most poetic painter of the early Renaissance. His masterpieces, The Birth of Venus and Primavera, are painted poems, the visual language of which has intrigued and mystified people for centuries. Both works seem to be painted in a kind of code based on the philosophy of Neoplatonism. Neoplatonism was more than a philosophical fashion in the 15th century. It was the spiritual side of the Renaissance. Its core belief is that man's origin is divine and his soul is immortal. Marsilio Ficino, a humble but inspiring genius, who woke with the sun every morning, abstained from sex, practiced vegetarianism, and eventually became a priest, was the father of the Neoplatonic movement in Florence. He headed an updated Platonic academy just outside Florence. Lorenzo de' Medici, Leone Battista Alberti, Sandro Botticelli, and Michelangelo all basked in Ficino's spiritual glow, carrying it into their work. Through Ficino's correspondence with philosophers, church leaders, statesmen, and kings from Hungary to England, Ficino spread Neoplatonic ideas and the Renaissance across Europe. Botticelli's Primavera, which may have been commissioned for a wedding, was supposedly based on Neoplatonic stories recounted by Lorenzo de' Medici and turned into a poem by the Renaissance poet Poliziano. In the painting, Venus, the goddess of love, presides over the garden and is the focus of the work. Her son Cupid, flying over her head, aims a fiery arrow at one of the three Graces. Blind as he is, Cupid never misses. Notice how one of the Graces eyes the god Mercury, who's too busy chasing clouds to notice her. Has she been wounded before Cupid shoots his arrow? Is Botticelli playing Neoplatonic tricks with time and simultaneous narrative? On the right, another love story unfolds, not one step at a time, but all at once. Puffy-cheeked Zephyr, the sky-colored wind god, thrusts himself into the painting to rape the nymph Chloris. During the encounter, Chloris begins to turn into somebody else, Flora, the goddess of flowers who is standing at her right. The flowers sprouting from her mouth signal the transformation. After the rape, Chloris Flora marries Zephyr and scatters flowers about the earth. As the blossoms touch the ground, they instantly take root. Venus's love garden exists in an eternal springtime, where youth is recycled over and over. Notice that this springtime also enjoys the benefits of fall, blossoming and ripening occur simultaneously. The trees live in 2 seasons at once, bearing September fruit and April blossoms. Another time trick? Maybe in Venus's mythical garden love transcends time, and we can experience all seasons at once. Donatello, putting statues back on their feet. Donatello helped birth the Renaissance with his friend Brunelleschi. Like him, Donatello championed a return to classical models in sculpture and architecture. His study of classical sculpture paid off. Acclaimed as the greatest sculptor of the 15th century, Donatello's achievements in sculpture equaled the Greeks. His bronze David was the first freestanding, life-size nude in 1,000 years. Before David, he'd sculpted superlative three-dimensional niche statues for the walls of Florence's or San Michele that seemed poised to march off their pedestals into the streets of the city. With David, Donatello took a bolder step and freed his statues completely from the restrictions of the Middle Ages. He literally put statues back on their feet. They were no longer glued and subordinate to architecture. Not only did Donatello free statues from their niches, but he broke another taboo by depicting David naked. The statue's unabashed, sensual nudity would have been X-rated in the Middle Ages. Figure 11-3, the highly polished bronze of Donatello. David helps to give the statue its sensual appeal. Gloria Wilder. The bronze warrior helmet of Goliath, under David's foot, and David's shepherds had emphasized that a gentle shepherd boy has overcome a brutish, gigantic warrior. David's flower-wreathed hat is still on his head. Goliath's helmet and head lie on the ground. A gentle, beautiful boy has overpowered a gargantuan bully, yet David doesn't gloat. He regards the fallen Goliath not triumphantly but wistfully, as if he might shed a tear for him. With David, Donatello made a political statement too. Milan was threatening Florence once again. His statue suggests that David, like Florence, a city of refinement, art, and beauty, is mightier than the brutish, Goliath-like dukes of Milan, who were bullying northern Italy. The High Renaissance. In the Middle Ages, men made things, they didn't create them. Medieval man believed only God could create. But around 1500, people began to view painters, sculptors, and architects as creators, too. Michelangelo was sometimes called the divine during his lifetime, a reflection of society's changing attitudes. Almost overnight, art makers evolved from artisans into artists, super geniuses who created works of wonder that seemed to rival nature, like Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper, Raphael's The School of Athens, and Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling. It was as if, during the Renaissance, man overcame a 1,000-year-old inferiority complex. In the Middle Ages, people knew their place, they were born into it and couldn't change it. If your father was a peasant, you were stuck being one, too. All you could do was hope for a better situation in the next life. Aiming too high in this life was a sin. If a medieval artist claimed to create something, he would have been viewed as trespassing on God's domain. During the Renaissance, men and women gained a new self-respect and learned to value life on earth as more than a pit stop on the road to the afterlife. Artists began to celebrate not only God, but man. Armed with supreme self-confidence, Renaissance artists dared to do what men had never before dared. The 3 superheroes of the High Renaissance are Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael. These High Renaissance geniuses broke through medieval limitations and elevated man with their paintbrushes, pens, and chisels. In the creation of Adam, Michelangelo painted Adam almost on the same level as God. The creator and his creation practically touch fingertips as the electric charge of life passes from God to man. No medieval artist ever depicted human beings on such a high level. Similarly, Leonardo elevated man, most famously when he attempted to lift man to the level that earlier generations had assigned to the angels. He gave man wings. Or tried to. In 1505, he designed a flying machine, 400 years before the Wright brothers launched their airplane at Kitty Hawk. Despite his ingenious work, Leonardo's flying machine never got off the page. But his Olympian effort to give man wings was more than high Renaissance. Ego, it was part of the new vision of man as a co-creator, nearly equal to God. Raphael elevated man in a quieter way. He brought the Holy Family down to earth, emphasizing Jesus's humanity even more than his divinity. In his paintings, the Holy Family look like ordinary people. Unlike medieval artists, Raphael, Michelangelo, and Leonardo almost always abandoned the halo. Leonardo da Vinci, the original Renaissance man. Leonardo da Vinci had a buffet-style brain, every specialty imaginable was on his mental menu. He was the ultimate Renaissance man, not just a super painter and sculptor, but an anatomist, biologist, botanist, engineer, inventor, meteorologist, musician, physicist, and writer. He was the almost discoverer of hundreds of inventions. But because he wrote backwards, no one understood his writings for centuries, and his discoveries went largely unnoticed. Leonardo's techniques. The techniques Leonardo employed, including aerial perspective, sfumato, and chiaroscuro, made figures and landscapes appear more realistic. This realism, more than anything else, is what distinguishes Renaissance art from medieval art. Aerial perspective. Leonardo invented the term for a kind of perspective based on his optical studies that he called aerial perspective. As Leonardo put it, aerial perspective depends on the differences in the thickness of the air. If you want to place a number of buildings behind a wall, some more distant than others, you must suppose that the air between the more distant buildings and the eye is thicker. Seen through such thick air, any object will appear bluish. If one building is 5 times farther back from the wall, it must be 5 times more blue. One of the early paintings in which Leonardo used aerial perspective is the Virgin of the Rocks. This masterpiece depicts John the Baptist, the Virgin Mary, Jesus, and an angel inside a secluded grotto that opens onto a scene of mystic mountains and a sunken river. You can almost feel the air getting thicker as your eye recedes into the painting. Sfumato. In the Virgin of the Rocks, the pale as mist blues and soft grays that delicately veil the landscape are Renaissance special effects called sfumato, which means smoky in Italian. Leonardo invented sfumato so he could capture subtle atmospheric changes with his brush and blend the outlines of figures into the environment. Now, instead of seeming superimposed on the background like a kid's cutouts, the figures look like they belong there. Sfumato is not dependent on distance like aerial perspective, where far-off mountains appear blue. In fact, the color of sfumato is more smoky gray than blue. Using sfumato, Leonardo blurred the edges of side-by-side objects just enough so that they seemed part of the same atmosphere. Chiaroscuro. Leonardo also used chiaroscuro, a painting technique invented by the ancient Greeks, but largely forgotten after the fall of ancient Rome in AD 476 until it was reintroduced to painting by Masaccio in the early 15th century. Chiaroscuro means light-dark in Italian. The shifts from light to dark in figures painted with this technique give the flesh a 3D feel. Notice how the shading and light in the Virgin's face and the Virgin of the Rocks help give depth to her features, bringing out the contours. This three-dimensional effect that is so prominent in Leonardo's paintings is very different from the work of his predecessors, such as Botticelli. As beautiful as Botticelli's faces are, they seem flat compared to Leonardo's. Later artists, like Caravaggio and Rembrandt, used chiaroscuro even more dramatically than Leonardo. Leonardo's greatest works. In the following sections, I take a closer look at 2 of Leonardo's most famous paintings, Mona Lisa and The Last Supper. Behind Lady Lisa's Smile. Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa is the most famous painting in the world. The model for the Mona Lisa was Lisa Gherardini del Giocondo, which is why the painting is also called La Gioconda, which means the smiling one. Figure 11.4. Among other things, the Mona Lisa is celebrated for its use of sfumato and aerial perspective. Réunion de Musées Nationaux Art Resource, New York. Some say the reason for the Mona Lisa's celebrity is that her eyes follow the viewer, others think it's her understated smile that captivates people. I think it's more than that, although she was painted 500 years ago, Mona Lisa seems to know her viewers. Her eyes and smile fascinate and disturb because they suggest that she sees through people's disguises, forcing them to see through their disguises, too. Mona Lisa is a kind of psychological mirror. The longer you gaze, the more you see yourself, through her eyes. She is the perfect icon of the Renaissance, a reflection of man and woman learning to know themselves. Check out the sfumato in the Mona Lisa and the use of aerial perspective. The background seems as sober, timeless, and wise as Lisa herself. Decoding the Last Supper. Though badly damaged, The Last Supper is still one of the greatest masterpieces in the history of art for many reasons, both historical and technical. For one thing, the painting is a spectrum of human emotions, the first of its kind, captured during an intensely dramatic moment. Previous paintings of the Last Supper focus on the breaking of bread and Jesus saying, "This is my body. Eat this in remembrance of me." The apostles and Jesus pretty much all share the same somber mood during the ritual. Leonardo chose to focus on a much more dramatic moment, Jesus telling his closest circle of friends that one of them will betray him. This causes an uproar among the apostles, which Leonardo captures, showing each of their reactions. Yet despite the chaos, the painting is orderly and finely balanced, like all great Renaissance art. Jesus's calm solitude, which contrasts with the animation of the groups of upset apostles, helps to give the painting its sense of order. Leonardo painted the Last Supper in a refectory. Located in the Santa Maria del Grazie Monastery in Milan, Italy. The table at which Jesus and his apostles sit is very much like the ones originally in the monks' dining room. The windows in the painting duplicate the real dining hall windows, and the illuminated wall appears to be lit by the real windows of the room, adding to the Renaissance realism of the mural. By doing this, Leonardo shifted this long-ago supper into the present tense. The Last Supper appears to reoccur every time the monks sit down to dinner. Earlier artists isolated Judas by making him sit by himself on one side of the table, as if he were already being punished. Leonardo seats him in high Renaissance fashion, in other words, naturalistically with the others, who are arranged in 4 groups of 3 around Jesus. The other apostles, except for the one on Jesus's right, argue about Jesus's revelation, "One of you will betray me." The painting's shadows fall on the guilty one. Judas's silence and the purse clutched in his hand give him away, too. Again, naturalism rather than the heavy symbolism used by medieval artists broadcasts the message, "This guy's guilty." When Leonardo includes symbolism, as he typically does, it appears as a natural element within the scene. Instead of a painted halo around Christ's head, as in medieval works of art, Leonardo painted a sunset and overcast sky directly behind Jesus, which form a natural halo around him. But his sky is more than a substitute halo. The setting sun foreshadows Jesus's approaching death, and the overcast atmosphere suggests his mood, sad yet serene. In the Last Supper, Leonardo used one-point perspective in a similar way. It's not just technique, it suggests meaning and the passage of time in a naturalistic way. Christ is the center of attention because of his position, pose, and silence, and because the center window and the arch on the back wall focus the painting's light on him. But, surprisingly, the painting's lines don't converge on Jesus. The vanishing point is behind him, implying that Jesus is about to vanish. All the lines in the painting, from those in the coffered ceiling, on the walls, and on the sides of the table, point to the place where Jesus is going. The vanishing point suggests the future, the next step, taking viewers beyond the painting into another world that they can't see. The scene has a cinematic feel. It's anything but static like Castagno's The Last Supper. Did Leonardo da Vinci code his painting? Judas and Jesus are not the only silent ones in the Last Supper. The apostle on Jesus's right is also mute. Usually, this disciple is identified as the young Saint John the Evangelist, the guy who wrote the Book of Revelation. In his bestseller The Da Vinci Code, Dan Brown identifies this figure as Mary Magdalene. The apostle does look like a woman or an effeminate man. Many brush off Dan Brown's interpretation for religious reasons. But Leonardo obviously intended this apostle to stand out from the rest. In other Last Supper paintings, the young John leans against Jesus or sleeps on his shoulder. In Leonardo's version, the apostle leans away from Jesus and his fate. Also, this apostle is dressed like Christ in reverse. Whereas Jesus wears a blue undergarment and a red robe, this figure wears a red undergarment and a blue robe. And as Dan Brown points out, together the two figures create a V shape, which Brown says is the symbol of femininity. As a great artist who used metaphors and double meanings in all his paintings, it's possible that Leonardo intentionally included this gender bender here. Is the silent apostle a sad, effeminate John or a broken-hearted Mary Magdalene? Or both? If you compare this figure to other Leonardo women, the face is clearly similar to theirs, especially Mary in the Virgin of the Rocks and the Annunciation. In both Virgin paintings, Mary leans to one side in a gesture of feminine tenderness, as the apostle does in the Last Supper. If you superimpose the silent apostle's face with that of Mary in the Virgin of the Rocks, the similarity is striking. They have the same feminine roundness in the forehead, the same cheekbones and chin, the same downcast, modest eyes, the same eyebrow line, an identical part in the hair, and the same graceful neck. It's as if the same model posed for both pictures, a woman. Nevertheless, many Renaissance artists, including Leonardo, sometimes gave young male saints feminine features. Considering the religious views at the time, including Mary in the Last Supper would have been viewed as heresy. If Leonardo were painting in code, as Brown suggests, he would probably have disguised her, given that, in those days, heretics were cooked on open fires. And who better to hide her behind than the effeminate face of John? The real Mary Magdalene may well have attended the historical Last Supper, so why not suggest her presence? The painting is rich enough to include this possibility. Is the apostle a woman, Jesus's other half? Mary is probably at least an implied presence in the Last Supper, if not a dinner guest. Remember, art is about suggestions, not answers. When you have an answer, if you're like most people, you tend to stop looking. With great art, you never stop looking. Michelangelo, the main man. Whereas Leonardo da Vinci created sensitive, intellectual paintings made to be contemplated in drawing rooms, Michelangelo produced a muscular, heroic art to cover vaulted ceilings, the walls of churches, and large public spaces. His sculptures and paintings seethe with energy and raw emotional power. Even his women are muscle-bound. Michelangelo's technique and style. In painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling, Michelangelo used the blown fresco technique, which dates back to around 1500 BC. One of the earliest blown frescoes is the Toreador on the island of Crete. In blown fresco, the artist paints on wet plaster without using a binder to make the paint stick. The plaster absorbs the pigment which dries with it in 10 to 12 hours. After the plaster dries, the paint is set and can't be changed. Therefore Michelangelo had to paint quickly and know in advance exactly what he was going to paint that day. The only way to fix a mistake was to pry off the plaster with a crowbar after it dried. Many of Michelangelo's statues seem to be in tug-of-war with themselves. Their minds pull one way, their bodies another. Part of this may be due to the fact that Michelangelo was equally inspired by Lorenzo de' Medici and the fiery evangelist Girolamo Savonarola, whom he befriended as a young man. Michelangelo loved to represent opposite forces in his art: spirit and flesh, night and day, freedom and slavery, peace and violence. In electricity, opposite charges cause current to flow. In Michelangelo's sculptures, the tension between opposites charges the statues with spiritual force. Michelangelo's greatest works. In the following sections, I cover 3 of Michelangelo's most celebrated works: the Pietà, David, and the Sistine Chapel ceiling. The Pietà. Michelangelo used tension in his early masterpiece The Pietà, begun when he was just 23 years old. In the Pietà, the dead Christ's muscles still show the strain from his recent agony on the cross, yet his face radiates perfect peace and glows with an otherworldly light. Michelangelo polished Christ's marble features so that they would reflect light as if it were radiating from within, suggesting Christ's transcendence of death. The relationship between Mary and Jesus in the Pietà also brims with tension. Mary cradles the dead Christ as she once cradled the infant Jesus. Her womb has become a tomb, death and life merge in her arms. Michelangelo's Pietà is a marriage of earthly suffering and heavenly beauty, the contrast between them making each spiritual state more intense, more electrifying. David. The tension in Michelangelo's David is just as potent as in the Pietà. David appears calm and confident, yet tense and poised for action like a taut bow. You can see the approaching battle in his eyes. He has the grace and physical harmony of a classical Greek statue, but the emotional intensity and titanic self-confidence of a Renaissance man. From a historical perspective, David was meant to be a symbol of Florence, small but tough. He was a warning to any wannabe Goliaths who might try to conquer Florence. Figure 11:5, in Michelangelo's version of the biblical story of David and Goliath, you see only the young challenger David. But you can sense Goliath's presence in David's focused and fearless eyes. Gloria Wilder. Sistine Chapel ceiling. Painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling was a 4-year backache Michelangelo didn't want. But there was no arguing with Julius II, the impatient pope who commissioned the work. In a poem written at the time, Michelangelo complained about his job, "My loins have moved into my guts as counterweight, I stick my bum out like a horse's rump. I bend backward like a Syrian bow." Michelangelo's grand struggle to paint a 68-foot-high ceiling the size of a basketball court is the most famous example in the history of art of an artist suffering for his work. The ceiling recounts Genesis and other Old Testament stories. The visual narrative begins with God separating light from darkness above the altar and ends with the story of Noah's drunkenness over the entrance. The creation of Eve is told in the middle of the ceiling. All the panels are framed by what looks like the classical architecture of an ancient temple. This faux sculpture is known as trompe-l'oeil. Inside the giant spandrels, Michelangelo painted the Old Testament stories. In the lunettes, he painted the ancestors of Jesus. In the most famous panel, the creation of Adam, Michelangelo captures the first moment of human consciousness with his brush. Adam has an adult body, but his face is filled with childlike wonder as he looks at God out of newly created eyes. His body and pose also suggest the innocence of this brand new being. Adam looks freshly minted, as peaceful and content as a newborn when he first meets his mother's eyes. In typical Renaissance fashion, the emphasis here is on man, on Adam's reaction to being created, more than on God, even in this traditional Bible story. Figure 11:6. Notice that in the creation of Adam, man is physically almost on the same level as God. Eric Lessing Art Resource, New York. Raphael, the Prince of Painters. High Renaissance art is often known for its grace, balance, and harmony. No painter better depicted these qualities than Raphael. Unfortunately, after a stunning outpouring of masterpieces, he died at 37. You can think of Raphael as the spiritual son of both Leonardo and Michelangelo. He learned from both of them, and then created his own style. He borrowed tenderness from Leonardo's paintings and muscular energy from Michelangelo. In Raphael's years in Florence, he painted the most motherly Madonnas of all time. Many of them appear on holiday postage stamps and Christmas cards today. Raphael's angels are popular, too, they're practically Valentine's Day icons. His Madonna and child paintings are often based on the pyramid and include John the Baptist. They're always perfectly balanced to illustrate ideal Renaissance order and perfect human harmony in relationships, as you can see in his Madonna with the goldfinch. Raphael's techniques. Raphael is known as the painter's painter. He was the ideal to which other painters aspired for nearly 400 years. What's so special about Raphael? For one thing, he built his paintings on geometrical grids, so the proportions and spacing between figures would appear as formal and perfect as a cube or triangle. For example, he often built his Holy Family paintings on a pyramid structure. Yet his paintings don't look like a math problem, they seem completely natural. Raphael united the perfect harmony of classical art with naturalism and idealism. By idealism, I mean that his paintings transport you to a place of perfect peace and beauty. Raphael's greatest work. Raphael's greatest masterpiece is the School of Athens. A fresco in the Stanza della Segnatura of the Vatican. The walls of the stanza weren't blank when Pope Julius II ordered Raphael to paint them, they were decorated with frescoes by other great artists, including Raphael's teacher Pietro Perugino and his friend Il Sodoma. The Pope commanded Raphael to cover their work with plaster and then paint over it. The School of Athens is really two schools, the Old School of Athens and the New School of Florence. Many Old School characters, including Plato, Euclid, and Heraclitus, are represented by New School artists. Plato has the face of the aging Leonardo da Vinci. Donato Bramante, the architect who got Raphael his job at the Vatican, represents Euclid studying a diagram. Figure 11:7, notice how Raphael divided the School of Athens into two balanced halves. Scala Art Resource, New York. Raphael's point was to suggest that Florence is the home of the rebirth of Greek culture and learning. 70 years earlier, Cosimo de' Medici had gathered Florentine thinkers and artists into an academy in Florence based on Plato's ancient school. But if that's the case, where's Michelangelo? Raphael stuck him in later, either as an afterthought or because he had sneaked a peek at the antisocial master while he was frescoing the Sistine Chapel ceiling next door. Raphael made Michelangelo the hermit-like Heraclitus in the foreground, the Greek philosopher who loved contradictions. Raphael even included himself in the lower right corner of the painting as a student. Note that Raphael is the only one in the School of Athens who is aware of the world outside the school. He looks directly at the viewer, perhaps to invite the viewer in. To make amends for covering up his art with plaster, Raphael placed his friend Il Sodoma beside him as a fellow student in the elite School of Athens. The School of Athens is a masterpiece of perspective, composition, and balance. The spatial balance, which is easy to see, suggests other kinds of balance. Raphael divided the painting into two halves, the Platonic idealists are on the left, the Aristotelian realists are on the right. Plato and Aristotle stand side by side at the focal point under the last arch. Plato, the idealist, points skyward, Aristotle, the realist, points straight ahead and down at the physical world. Raphael put these two opposing schools of philosophy under one roof so that they could balance each other. In front of the dueling philosophers, Heraclitus ponders the union of opposites. Western philosophy and science aren't the entire curriculum in the School of Athens. A dose of Eastern philosophy, represented by the great Persian mystic Zoroaster and the 12th century Arab Wunderkind Averroes, brings additional balance to the school. The arches within arches that frame the school don't shut it off from the rest of the world. Instead, they open it up, allowing knowledge to breathe and expand into the universe beyond the school's walls. Chapter 12. Venetian Renaissance, Late Gothic, and the Renaissancian the North. In this chapter, homing in on the Venetian Renaissance, understanding late Gothic painting. Tracking the Renaissance to the Low Countries. In this chapter, I trace the spread of the Renaissance northward, first to Venice, then to Germany and the Low Countries. I also examine the late Gothic style in Flanders. A gondola ride through the Venetian Renaissance. With almost 250,000 residents, Venice was a Renaissance boomtown and one of Europe's greatest cities. Population-wise, it dwarfed Rome. Almost all of Europe's trade with the Near East and Far East filtered through Venice. In fact, Venice was the greatest port town in Europe. The city teemed with exotic goods and merchants from all over the known world. Europeans venturing south over the Alps, on pilgrimages or business trips, typically stopped to refuel in Venice before journeying to other Italian destinations. Those travelers sometimes hauled artworks across the Alps with them. Great Venetian families often collected the latest in Dutch, French, and German styles. Venice was an artistic melting pot. This meant that a Venetian artist like Giovanni Bellini could learn of the oil painting innovations of a Flemish artist like Jan van Eyck simply by checking out the paintings trickling in on the art market or by observing visiting artists who had mastered northern techniques. Venetian artists had the world at their brush tips, and they wound up surpassing other nations and Italian city-states in oil painting and the use of rich colors. Venice offered another advantage for artists. It was politically stable for more than 1,000 years, so stable, in fact, that most official documents referred to the city as the most serene republic. Today, few people realize that Venice had the longest-running republican form of democracy, uninterrupted from around 750 to 1797 when Napoleon Bonaparte marched in and squelched everything. It was hardly a perfect democracy, only the 1,400 or so people of noble bloodline could vote. But Thomas Jefferson and other founding fathers of the United States studied Venice closely as a model for representative democracy. In Renaissance times, this form of government meant that, although the rest of Italy was a bloody battleground for competing dukes, princes, and foreign kings, an artist or cutting-edge author could generally find safe haven and a good market in Venice. In the following sections, I explore the art of Giovanni Bellini, Andrea Mantegna, Giorgione, Titian, Paolo Veronese, and Tintoretto, as well as the architecture of Andrea Palladio. First stop, Bellini. If you order a Bellini in a bar, the bartender will serve you a drink made from white peaches and Italian champagne. The mixture has a distinct pink glow. It's the same beautiful shade of pink that Giovanni Bellini once mixed on his palette and applied to such masterpieces as his San Zaccaria altarpiece in Venice. What better compliment for a Renaissance painter than to have the colors he mixed 500 years ago continue to inspire revelers today? Although Renaissance artists got to mix their own colors on their palettes, it was usually some underling in the studio who had to grind the pigments in a pestle and mortar so that they could be mixed with oil or egg tempera. In the Renaissance, artists' workshops were often like mini-corporations. Besides the immediate family members, the shop included numerous non-family apprentices and journeymen performing different tasks and assisting in the production of art. The young folks had the laborious jobs of sanding wood, grinding pigment, cleaning the studio, and running errands. The older apprentices sometimes painted parts of a picture, filling in the drapery, painting the backgrounds, and so on. The goal was to imitate the master's style. Giovanni Bellini grew up in a family of artists, so he had a privileged spot in the studio. His father, Jacopo, kept splendid sketchbooks of drawings that were really corporate trade secrets. The sketchbooks showed novices how to make good animals, interesting scenes, and convincing perspective. The pressure was on Giovanni, because his older brother, Gentile, had already proven to be an outstanding painter. Fortunately for Giovanni, and for us, he surpassed all expectations. His Virgin and Child images are some of the most lifelike and intimate in all of art history. Bellini's Madonnas often pop up on Christmas cards and stamps. His paintings glitter with the rich Byzantine colors he grew up seeing in Venice's great churches. Though Bellini started painting in egg tempera, he found it too dry and the colors too flat. He soon switched to the new oil painting technique used by artists in the Low Countries, and introduced it to Venice in the 1470s. This technique allowed him to softly model his figures, mix and remix his colors, and create glowing effects of light and dark. In Bellini's Feast of the Gods, the gleaming effects mentioned earlier are set against the dark backdrop of a secluded wood. The theme is taken from Ovid's ancient book, The Feasts, which describes the origins of Roman festivals. Bellini illustrated a feast hosted by Bacchus, the god of wine. At the party, the beautiful nymph Lotus, shown at the far right on Bellini's canvas, falls asleep after consuming too much wine. The figure shown lifting her skirt is Priapus, the lustful god of virility. In Ovid's humorous account, Priapus's attempt is foiled by a braying donkey. Lotus wakes up and repels the god of virility. Bellini animated the staged scene by organizing the figures along a slightly wavy compositional line. The viewer feels the drunken sway of this pastoral fantasy. A shortcut to Mantegna and Giorgione. Giovanni Bellini's sister, Nicolosia, married the artist Andrea Mantegna, further expanding the Bellini art business. But whereas Giovanni's art explored color and soft contour, Mantegna picked up on Jacopo Bellini's interests in line and perspective. For Mantegna, color takes a back seat to drawing. Mantegna had a knack for creating elaborate stage sets of ancient architecture that seemed to tunnel back in space. He painted a portrait of the Gonzaga family in Mantua in what appears to be an open-air pavilion. The illusion of depth is so convincing that the actual walls of the Gonzaga bedroom where the frescoes are painted seem not to exist. In other works, his crumbling Roman capitals and broken arches make for some of the most imaginative architecture ever painted. Mantegna also liked to show the human figure in perspective, sometimes dramatically foreshortened. His Dead Christ depicts Jesus stretched out on his back like a corpse in a morgue. The figure is so foreshortened that the viewer gets a close-up view of Christ's punctured feet, which seem to project out of the painting. Regardless of your religious beliefs, the picture is painful, and Mantegna's precise lines don't soften the gruesome image. Giovanni Bellini's pupil, Giorgione, on the other hand, was all about softness. He took Venetian painting in the direction it would follow for centuries. Leonardo da Vinci's sfumato technique is also used by Giorgione. The warm light and glowing presence of Giorgione's figures make them seem a natural part of the rustic landscapes they frequently inhabit. One of Giorgione's greatest works, The Tempest, shows a nude woman suckling a child while sitting on a hill near a stream. She gazes wistfully into the distance, seemingly unaware of the child. On the other side of the bank, a young man holding a staff and dressed as if he were from another world stops to watch her. In the background, a storm gathers and lightning flashes in the sky. But neither the impending storm nor the woman's faraway gaze can dispel the serenity of this poetic and mysterious painting. It haunts the viewer without letting him into its secrets. Many books have been written in an attempt to explain this puzzling picture, but nobody has figured it out. Even Giorgio Vasari, writing just 50 years after Giorgione's death, had to admit that the meanings of some of the artist's works had been lost. Vasari also said that Giorgione was soon eclipsed by the fame of his star pupil, Titian. Apparently, the older artist overheard people praising a part of his work but then became unnerved when he realized that it was the portion he had delegated to Titian. Dürer's Venice Vacation. When the great German draftsman and printmaker, Albrecht Dürer first visited Venice in 1494, he couldn't stop drawing and painting watercolors. As he approached Italy, he made watercolors of the Alps from his carriage window. The drawing started when he reached Venice. German artists at the time didn't usually draw or paint from nude models, but Italians did. When Dürer met Italian artists who were working directly from live models, he started drawing nudes as well. He also made quick sketches of the fashionable dresses that the beautiful Venetian women wore, drawing them in the streets. Dürer had such a good time on his first trip that he returned to Venice in 1506. Dürer's most famous work from this second journey is the Madonna of the Rose Garlands. It owes a lot to the example of Bellini. Commissioned for the Venetian Charterhouse of German merchants, this altarpiece depicts graceful figures flanking the Virgin. All the subjects are rendered in rich, warm colors and painted in a carefully blended technique reminiscent of Bellini's. The trips to Italy reshaped Dürer's style of art and even his style of dress. His self-portrait at age 26, which he made after his first trip, shows an increasingly confident artist decked out like an Italian dandy. Behind him, the window reveals a view of the Alps separating Germany and Italy. The portrait shows off Dürer's newly acquired rank as Erberin, a member of Nuremberg's merchant class, even as it reminds everyone that he has traveled widely. Everything about the picture says, "I have come into my own." Yet, when the artist returned to self-portraiture 2 years later, in 1500, he made his image resemble Christ's. That painting, now in Munich, may have been inspired by a comment jotted down in the artist's own notes: "The more we know, the more we resemble the likeness of Christ who truly knows all things." Figure 12:1. Albrecht Dürer's self-portrait at age 26 shows the young artist as a rising star. Eric Lessing Art Resource, New York. Many people in Dürer's day believed that 1500 would be the year of the apocalypse or Judgment Day. In that climate of fear, the savvy Dürer illustrated a book on the apocalypse in 1496 and published it in Latin and German editions. It became a bestseller. The woodcuts from this book secured his status as one of Europe's best printmakers. Touring the 16th century with Titian. The beautiful Venetian women that caught Dürer's eye are best captured on canvas by the painter Tiziano Vecellio de Cadore, better known as Titian. When he was alive, Venetians called him the sun amidst small stars. Today Titian is regarded as Venice's most famous, and possibly greatest, painter. His rich, earthy palette can include fiery colors, as well as blues of the coolest sapphire. His portraits are so psychologically powerful that each of them seems like a page lifted out of Shakespeare. A portrait of the Holy Roman Emperor earned the artist a knighthood, and Titian was subsequently presented with a huge, golden chain that he wore in all his self-portraits. Spanish royalty avidly collected his works, and later Baroque artists from Diego Velázquez to Peter Paul Rubens copied his paintings. Titian painted the largest altarpiece Venice had ever seen, the Assumption of the Virgin, which still stands in the church of the Santa Maria Gloriosa dei Frari. But the work for which Titian is best known today, the painting whose sexiness inspired the humorist Mark Twain to write A Tramp Abroad, is the reclining nude Venus of Urbino. Figure 12-2, Venus of Urbino is Titian's most sensual masterpiece. E. Scala Art Resource, New York. Mark Twain, the great American satirist, jokingly recorded how, upon entering the Uffizi in Florence, you proceed to that most visited little gallery in the world, the Tribune, and there, against the wall, without obstructing rag or leaf, you many look upon the foulest, the vilest, the obscenest picture the world possesses, Titian's Venus. It isn't that she is naked and stretched out on a bed, no, it is the attitude of one of her arms and hand. If I ventured to describe that attitude, there would be a fine howl, but there the Venus lies, for anybody to gloat over that wants to, and there she has a right to lie, for she is a work of art, and art has its privileges. Her left hand does seem to be preoccupied. Perhaps Titian intended to create a fertility symbol of that hand, along with other elements in the painting. You can puzzle those out for yourself. This version of the goddess of love hails from Urbino, Italy, because Guidobaldo II della Rovere, the son of the Duke of Urbino, commissioned the picture. The Venus of Urbino is inspired by a much earlier sleeping Venus in a landscape painted by Giorgione and finished by Titian. But in Titian's solo effort, the goddess is indoors and a lapdog curls at her feet as a symbol of fidelity. Two servant women pull out one of the goddess's elegant dresses from a wedding chest along the back wall. The lollipop-shaped bush in the pot on the back ledge is a myrtle, a shrub sacred to Venus in ancient times. Titian is now held to be one of the best painters to ever wield a brush, and he wielded many brushes of radically different sizes. His early works are more linearly precise and painted with small to medium-sized brushes. But by the time Titian was an old man, Vasari jokingly described Titian's large, fat brushes as brooms. For late Titian paintings, even the strongest eyeglass prescription won't bring the canvases into focus. The artist was so obsessed with painterly effects and heavy surface impasto that the lines of his subjects all but disappear. The Venice of Veronese. By the mid-16th century, Martin Luther's Protestant Reformation had spread over large parts of Europe. Its followers railed against the excesses of the Catholic Church and the selling of indulgences. They encouraged people to read the Bible for themselves, instead of accepting the Church's interpretation without question. Such protests were really getting under the Vatican's skin. In 1545, Pope Paul III called Catholic bishops from all over Europe to attend a series of meetings in northern Italy. At these meetings, known as the Council of Trent, Catholics passed reforms for the Church and tried to suppress the heretical offshoots of Luther, Calvin, and the rest. The Council of Trent took place intermittently from 1545 to 1563 in Trent, Italy, and established the Counter-Reformation, or Catholic Reformation. The council passed tougher codes of conduct to reform the priests. They also declared the importance of religious images, because the Protestants were destroying the images of saints that once decorated churches. The council stated that artists should pursue more dramatic and sober scenes in art to better instill a sense of piety in their audience. Trent was practically in Venice's backyard, and it wasn't long before a series of political alliances brought the Inquisition to Venice to stamp out heresy. The Inquisition soon got wind that a Last Supper painted by Paolo Veronese for a monastery didn't portray the Christian story with the seriousness and solemnity advised in the edicts of the Council of Trent. Just who complained about the canvas is unclear, because the monks loved having it in their dining hall. Nonetheless, when Veronese was hauled before the tribunal, they asked him to explain the eccentricities of his painting and what various figures in the painting were supposed to be doing. The inquisitors were especially peeved that the artist showed two German guards at the far right taking bread and wine, as if the Protestants were administering their own communion. Paolo Veronese was ordered to correct